I'm going to do about another 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to be flying through some of these slides because I don't want to spend too much time on it. This week is around individuals with with special needs other than disabilities. And I like to include in that conversation the needs of students who are diverse learners, okay? So let's think about how you define diversity. What does that mean to you? And then take a moment to think about ways that you and your either mentor, teacher, or even you, if you're already in the classroom. I know we have several lateral entry teachers and current gen ed teachers. How do you engage in culturally responsive practices? And then third, do you believe that students from diverse backgrounds have special needs other than disabilities? So think about these things, reflect on your current practice and how your answers to these questions might impact the work that you do in the classroom. It's important to remember that multicultural education is education. And so I think sometimes we think about multiculturalism as a separate part of what we do in education. And it is to some extent in that we need to address the needs of multicultural learners by knowing more about what they bring to the table in terms of their background, in terms of their language, in terms of their experiences. But it is education. So we all have a role to play in providing multicultural education for all of our learners. So as you know, the makeup of U.S. schools have grown to be more and more diverse over the past few decades. And I think there's an estimate, I forget the exact numbers, in what year that that there will essentially be more ethnic diversity in the U.S. than there has ever been, and that there will be more Black and brown children and students more broadly than European American students. And so the dynamics and the history of what this country has looked like, especially in schools, will be quite different. We know historically that there's been an overrepresentation of, again, Black and brown children in special education. And we talked a little bit about that in the beginning of this class. Some of that had to do with the diagnostic measures that were culturally insensitive, that were not given in the language, in the child's native language, that were provided by diagnosticians or psychologists who were operating in their implicit biases. So there are a number of issues that have contributed to the overrepresentation of particular populations of students in special education. And more recently, there is an underrepresentation related to autism, specifically in children of color, and also an underrepresentation of children of color who are who are identified as gifted learners. So it's important in the work that we do to embed the global perspectives of the students that we teach, the global perspectives of the families that the students are a part of, and to reflect on the global perspectives that you bring to the table. So I know there are some of you in here who have studied abroad. Think about your experiences in those foreign countries and what your experiences were like for your students and for yourself, but also think about your own cultural background and what you bring, what values you bring to the table, what heritage you bring, what language you bring, and really try to reflect on the impact that your experiences, your knowledge, your own implicit biases, because we all have them. It's important to think about what role that plays in your educating of students. So think here, what does culture mean to you? And what does it include? Okay. And then think more about cultural responsiveness. What is that? And then cultural competence. So take a moment, if you aren't familiar with some of these terms, do a quick Google search and then just write down the definitions, because I really want you to understand the difference between being culturally competent and then being culturally responsive. And we often like to take it a step further and talk about engaging in cultural reciprocity. So think about how disability fits into the discussion of culture and why it's important to acknowledge the cultural diversity of the students that you teach. So to become a culturally responsive teacher, you need to engage in these ongoing processes. And I'm not going to read each of these, but you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side that the first part is having a sense of self-awareness, having an open attitude, building your awareness of others, learning more about their culture, and then understanding cross-cultural skills and how to embed those into your practices. So you can reference this slide, and maybe I'll try to upload some additional culturally relevant readings for you that are in addition to our textbook that you could reference as a tool when thinking about how to support learners who are culturally, ethnically diverse. So some challenges that we've seen in identifying and serving English language learners, English language learning students with disabilities are here. So there are things like lack of clarity in state policy guidelines, a lot of limited knowledge around linguistic and cultural diversity, and then lack of resources for providing services. So these are challenges that many of us face when serving students who are English language learners. There are some components of serving students with cultural and linguistic diversity that are important. So having clear policy guidelines is critical. Having adequate professional development. I cannot say enough about the PD. So I know you all are going to be super busy teachers. You're going to be tired. Some of you will be coaches. Some of you will be working second jobs. Some of you will be getting master's degrees. Some of you have families. I understand that you're going to be doing a lot. But when you have opportunities to attend professional development trainings, I would really, really encourage you to do so. There are lots of opportunities to go to trainings around, managing behavior, learning more about cultural diversity, partnering with parents, those sorts of things. So do take advantage of those opportunities when you can. Other components of serving students who are culturally and ethnically diverse include effective and valid assessment and instruction. So again, this goes back to the idea that no longer is it okay for us to be administering tests or administering evaluations that are not sensitive to the diversity of the students who are taking them. Okay. And then having interdepartmental collaboration. So you should talk to your team teachers and talk to the specials teachers and talk to the administrators. Find out if they're having the same issues with the student that you're having. And if they are, in fact, not, think about what factors might be contributing to that. Okay. Think about it from a cultural perspective and what you can do to support your learners in that regard. So students with special needs other than disabilities include those who are not eligible for special ed services, but they have needs that put their learning at risk. So for this, you might think of students who have, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but who have ADHD. It may be students who have physical disabilities that do not require them to be in a separate setting, but that does require them to have, let's say, for example, extra time on a test. So I usually use my brother as an example. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but my younger brother has a brachial plexus injury in his left arm. And so he does not have, he has very limited use of his left arm. He's able to kind of use it to steady things on, but he's not able to extend his fingers and use his hand. He's played college level football and soccer, and I don't think he ever played baseball. But anyways, he has not let that disability stop him from doing anything that he's wanted to do, and is now, is really thriving. However, while he was younger and still in school, it did impede his ability to write. So he struggled with his writing. He wasn't able to do things like tying his shoes, but his physical disability, the brachial plexus injury, did not have an impact directly on his learning, right? So it wasn't related to an intellectual disability or IQ. It didn't have an impact on his IQ, but he did need extra time for writing, because if you can imagine trying to write with one hand, you're not able to hold the paper and steady things. So it meant that he had needs that put his learning at risk, because those things become frustrating. And so those are the sorts of issues that, if we're able to troubleshoot in advance and provide accommodations for students in advance, then you avoid the later risks of things like behavior problems. Because imagine you getting frustrated, or your pencil breaks, or your shoe is not untied, and you can't do those things without support. Imagine the kind of behaviors that might arise as a result of that frustration. Other students who have special needs aside from disabilities often benefit from the same strategies that we use for students with disabilities. And really, this just is a reflection and a representation of the diverse student population that we're serving. It's not that these students should be in special education, it's just that they need additional accommodations and supports to help them be more successful or be as successful as they can be in their current setting. So 504 plans, I think we talked a little bit about these when we talked about IEPs. This is a result of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And if a student has a 504 plan, it means that they have a substantially limiting major life substantial limits on a major life activity, and it extends beyond the 13 federal categories, so it's not inclusive of autism or intellectual disability. And it's a broader definition than in the IDEA, so it captures students with other needs aside from the 13 categories. So you can read more about 504 plans. I won't read through all of that. And then let's think about ADHD. So is it one of the 13 disability categories? Hopefully your answer was no. I already showed you that, so hopefully you change your answer to no when you saw that sneak peek. ADHD occurs 2 to 3 times more often in boys than girls. It's typically lifetime. The chronic symptoms are noticed before age 12. It's usually diagnosed in individuals who do not have intellectual disability, and it's often characterized by an inability to regulate attention or to develop executive functions. So we'll talk more about executive functions in a second, but ADHD is probably one of the most common challenges that you will face in the classroom. And I pause because I didn't want to use the word disability because it's not technically recognized as a disability category by IDEA. Students with ADHD are either usually fall into one of two categories. A, they might be diagnosed as OHI or other health impairment if their ADHD is so severe that it's impacting their learning. It may be diagnosed as OHI. The second option is that students who have ADHD will receive a 504 plan, which can accommodate some of their needs. But again, we recognize that that does not include, it is not one of the 13 categories. So for students who have ADHD, that is not severe enough to impact their learning to a certain extent, they may not be eligible for an IEP. So it gets a little bit tricky with ADHD, but it's important to remember that it is not one of the 13 official IDEA categories. So here are some descriptions of what ADHD how it might present in students. So I will let you read through those. And then some more information around ADHD and medications. And then some of the problems that you might experience with students who have ADHD. On this slide, you'll see more about classroom interventions and how you can support students with ADHD. So things like environmental supports, having academic interventions, and using your include strategy. You can also use behavioral interventions in parent education. Having that parent education in the carryover from home to school is really critical for supporting learners who have ADHD. You can read more on this slide about families and how to engage families, thinking about the types of language to use and appropriate ways to support them. Okay, feel free to pause here for a break. We're actually way more than halfway finished because I'm going to wrap up very quickly. So sorry for the timing of this, but you can obviously take a break if you like. If not, keep going. So executive functioning, I mentioned that in the discussion around ADHD, is a set of mental processes that helps to connect your past experiences with the present action. So how many of you wake up every morning, you kind of have a routine, and one of the things in your routine is checking your calendar for the day? I know personally I have so many meetings and activities that I literally rely on my calendar to know what I have coming up. And so that is part of this idea of executive functioning. We use activities we use our executive function to perform activities such as planning and organizing and strategizing and remembering details. So it's not something that we don't all do. It's something that some people need some more support with than others. So read through here about executive functioning and ways to respond to the needs of students who struggle with executive functioning. So this is what difficulties with EF might look like in your classroom. And then here are some strategies that you can use to support learners in that way. And then here are some specific strategies that would work well for you. So not for the learners, but I know sometimes students are like, well, Dr. P, I know we talk a lot about what we should do for students, but like, how can we be more successful as teachers? Well, here are some things that can work for you. You can think about talking less, right? Providing too much input for students who are already struggling with organization and processing might be challenging for them. So sometimes talking less is more. Sometimes you have to be patient and wait the child out, not forcing your students to do activities that are overwhelming. So these are strategies that would be effective for you to implement. So we are actually very close to the end. I don't know how that break got put so far back, but I would like for you to think about how you might engage in an instructional strategies workshop with the student who has ADHD. So the first thing I'd like for you to do is to pause here and identify 2 to 3 strategies that you can employ to support Seth. So Seth is the 3rd grader in this case study who has been on medication to help manage his ADHD. I know many of you are middle grade students, but let's just roll with it. So you want to think about ways that you might collaborate with Seth's parents to generalize these skills across settings. And you can reference some of the suggestions that I just highlighted on the previous slides. And then you want to think about what peer-to-peer strategies you might employ to support him. Okay? And then when you wrap that up, we'll move on into gifted and talented learners. So Jacob Javits Gifted and Talented Students Education Act, this was enacted in the late 80s, and this essentially identifies intellectual, creative, academic, and leadership abilities in students. And so this act says that these students have unique needs, and it does not require specific services, but it leaves this to states and local districts. So AIG is quite different, and even from district to district, and most definitely from state to state, and it's often affected by prevalence and potential. So this is a diagram of Gardner's multiple intelligences, and you can kind of look through the definitions of each of these and how they play a role in our intelligence and in our sort of giftedness. And then you think about the potential of students who are gifted or talented. Some students are quite easily recognized, but in other cases, many of them go unnoticed. And so there are some at-risk groups like young boys or teen girls or geniuses or those from diverse cultures who and those who have disabilities who might be overlooked because, quite frankly, there's a misconception that students with disabilities cannot also be gifted learners, and that is absolutely untrue. So you want to keep that in mind, that there is potential in all learners to be gifted, and you don't want to just make assumptions about what giftedness means or what it looks like for your students. So here are some additional characteristics and needs of students who are gifted and talented, so you can read through those. And then here are some specific interventions. So you might really spend some time thinking about these interventions as they're described in your book. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. We'll talk more about differentiation in an upcoming module, and that will really kind of address, I would assume it would address some of the questions you might have in terms of how to support gifted and talented learners. All right, take a break here, and we're going to do another short activity. You can read through this. I won't read it to you, but I do strongly suggest that you do it because it will be really helpful in thinking about how states and school districts define and describe gifted learners and the processes they use for supporting them, okay? And then we're going to wrap up with another enrichment activity in terms of overcoming unique challenges. So on the upcoming pages, there are going to be several scenarios about student learners, and I would like for you to imagine that one or two of them, you can choose maybe two of those scenarios, and imagine that they are a student in your current placement or your classroom, or hopefully, I think all of you should at least be in observations by now or have some classroom that you can reference for these activities. And then I would like for you to draw a concept map that identifies factors to consider and strategies to support your student and his or her family. So the idea here is to really pay attention to who your student is, what they bring to the table, what challenges they might bring, what areas of strength they might bring, and then how can you support your student and his or her family. So again, remember to include each of the steps of include. Think about what we talked about related to diversity, related to gifted learners, and then design a quick concept map that highlights factors to consider, and then strategies to support the students that you choose. So you can select any two of these students. Okay. And then a quick wrap up. So for this week, we have the Friend and Bursup Chapter 8. So now that we are on Module 9, because of the break or whatever happened, at some point in the semester, we went from being on the same module and the same chapter numbers to no longer being aligned. So anyways, if you were relying on that like I was as a reminder, it's not going to work anymore because we are on Module 9 in Chapter 8, okay? For this week, you get a break from your reflection, so you can spend that time focusing on finishing up your disability investigation, which is due on Sunday by 11:55, as always. And then as a reminder, you will have your inclusive teaching proposal, which is due on Sunday, November 11th, by 11:55 p.m. So I'll try to do these reminders for your next couple of assignments so that you are all aware. And I think that's everything. As always, if you have questions or concerns, feel free to reach out, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you for listening.